what is philosophy of mind? I'm asking this because, like, when I hear somebody like me who really does not have that much of an integration with the philosophical side of things, like when we hear philosophy, it's about like how we think, how we process information, those kind of things. But what is exactly like philosophy of mind? Is there like a distinct meaning behind it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because, yeah, there is a sense in which philosophy, many people will already just think of philosophy as like thinking about many things that are related to the mind because it's about understanding the world and it's about trying to connect like bigger picture things. And in a sense, all of that comes from our minds. Philosophy of mind is it. I mean, the primary distinction is really like it's technically just arbitrary, right? It is how that distinction has emerged in part, at least not entirely, but in part through like how it's been taught in the academy and stuff like that. And so, but the way that I was trained is in what's called analytic philosophy. So this is and the philosophy of mind more specifically is basically trying to understand the mind, often considered distinct from the brain. Though for many people, like many academics don't actually believe that, but it is sort of it's sort of addressing an array of topics that people associate, at least based on how like the academic stuff that's come up, associate with like the mind. So common themes are consciousness, intentionality, like how we think, um, meaning, like how words acquire meaning. Um, yeah, it's kind of like a lot of it, and a huge amount of it is like the mind body problem, which is what I did my dissertation in. But then I also have like frustrations with this, in that to me, like the mind is so much broader than that. It's the unconscious mind. It's studying the brain. Some people don't even think that the mind is, completely connected to the brain. You could think that the mind is something to do with like extended mind. Um, there's phenomenology, like there's a lot of other traditions that just get kind of left out of the typical like term philosophy of mind when we think about it. But that's essentially what it is.
Is there a difference between, again, this could be the stupid question I would probably ask, is there a
No,
difference
no such
between
thing as.
is there a difference between a mind and a brain?
I mean, no, this is an excellent question. And it's actually it's one of the foundational questions in the field. Like, can you distinguish the mind from the brain? Should you distinguish the mind from the brain? I don't personally think that you should. Like, to me, I think of it as the mind slash brain. Um, Such that sometimes we use the term brain and sometimes we use the term mind to describe the same thing. But really, the primary difference for me is that we describe, when we're talking about something we have like a better understanding of scientifically, we talk about the brain because like we feel like we understand it better. So if you go to like a neuroscientist, they're going to talk about the brain because like they're studying neurons and they might have like a specific theory of something, and they're confident that in what they're talking about, at least like a little bit more confident than we often are in philosophy. And then you go to something like consciousness or intentionality, and all of a sudden people start using the word mind. But I think it's just because like we don't have a good understanding of those things in terms of the brain. But to me, it's kind of a mistake to think that that means it's some like separate thing. It's just a part of the brain that we don't have a good understanding of, you know?
Hmm.
We just don't really know like what it is. So, but this is, I mean, Descartes is kind of known in like the Western philosophy tradition for like establishing this distinction. If you go back to like Plato, for example, um, they just like Greek philosophy did not have this distinction. They thought of they just did not distinguish between a mind and a brain. And so they talk much more broadly about they basically talk about mind in a much broader way. Um, and it's really Descartes that starts this question that you asked.
Yeah, but what do you think? Do you think there is a difference between a mind and a brain?
No. So my entire dissertation was on this question in a way, the mind body problem. And the mind body problem in philosophy is it's honestly like one of the biggest questions that occupies philosophers of mind. even when it's sometimes not the like explicit question going on, it's always like lurking in the background. And I when I was in grad school, I stumbled on Noam Chomsky's work. And one of the arguments that he has, Noam Chomsky obviously does like a ton of things. He's known for so many things. But he has engaged with philosophy of mind and language, because he like one of the things he's most well known for is like basically founding like what's called generative grammar today. Um, and so I found like this argument of his, which said that there is no mind body problem because we don't have a conception of the body. So traditionally, the body in the mind body problem includes the brain.
Mhm.
So the mind, as distinct from everything in the world that that we think of essentially as physical, including the brain, like our arms and legs, my phone, like this water bottle, anything physical. Also, like atoms, molecules, quarks, like anything the physics studies, all of it. Um, and I just found this argument really interesting, in part because I could not make head nor tails of the literature. I was so confused by the mind body literature. It was really confusing to me, and it felt sort of arbitrary and strange. And so then I found the work of this physician called Gabor Mate,
Mhm.
who talks about he's written like a number of books. I think for the most of his life he's a practicing physician, but he's written like a number of books, all of which I find really fascinating. And he had this book talking about how there's no distinction between the mind and the body, even if you look at like if you look at the mind from a biomedical lens. And so I just thought that that was really interesting. And I was like, like, how can I connect these two things to say something kind of relatively different in the literature that we have in the mind body problem today? And so what the dissertation ended up looking at was the kind of background reasons for Chomsky's argument that we don't know what the body is, which is a really counterintuitive idea, because you're like, what do you mean I don't know what the body is? Like, here's my body. Like, here's a physical thing. Like, it's concrete. I know what it is. Um, but he has this, he like Chomsky like brought on or like used a lot of history of science literature to argue this point, which I thought was really interesting, because we don't look at the history of science and philosophy of mind, and we really should. It's not like you can just understand these things like outside of the cultural context that they were in. And so in the history of science, you go back to like the 17th century, right before like Newtonian gravitation became a thing, and you find like that all the main scientific thinkers, like the big quote unquote scientists, you think of like Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Robert Boyle, Huygens. They were like all these like big science thinkers. And they had this like very, very specific conception of the world. They argued that the world was just like a big mechanical clock. And the quote that always stands out to me from one of these books is like, I think it was Robert Boyle claiming that like the world is fundamentally just like this particular clock he saw in Strasbourg. And so the idea behind this is that nature is fundamentally mechanical, where mechanical had like a highly specific meaning. It required that for there to be contact, or that for there to be influence between two objects, you needed contact. So everything was a part of this huge mechanical clock where everything moves in accordance to very specific, like tangible features that we can see in the world. And so on the assumption that the world was like this, which was kind of like it was like a metaphysical picture of what the world was like, but it was also a scientific hypothesis for them. Descartes believed this, Galileo believed this, even Newton also believed this, and was actually like, if you read the history about it, he was really annoyed and upset by the fact that his laws of gravity just didn't make sense in this picture. Um, but they had this idea that, okay, well, if we think that if the world is just like fundamentally like a big mechanical clock, then to explain the world, like to offer physical explanations of nature, we need to show that the world operates like this. And so Galileo would come up with all these experiments to show that he could explain motion in this way. And it ended up obviously leading to some false views. But it also made big strides, right? That people like Newton um, followed on or like used in his own work. And Descartes was also a big proponent of this view. And so Descartes, but Descartes was interested specifically in looking at the limits of mechanical explanation. So he, like Galileo, was like interested in all this stuff, but he seemed much less concerned and interested with physics as like than Galileo, Newton, etc. He was a lot more interested in the mind. And so he tried to like figure out the limits of mechanical explanation. And Chomsky has really good work laying this out if people didn't want to have to like go back and read Descartes. But there's also a lot of good science books that talk about how Descartes was thinking of this. And so Descartes basically argued that, okay, we can explain nearly everything in mechanical terms, or the term mechanical meant physical, meant body. But he claimed that there were two big things that we sort of couldn't explain in this way. One was consciousness. And for Descartes, consciousness is not what we often think of today. Like today, philosophers think of consciousness as, I'm not even going to go into it, but it's a very different how Descartes is thinking of it. Consciousness for Descartes is reflective self-awareness, like my ability to be aware of the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you on a podcast, et cetera, et cetera. Generally speaking, I think the vast majority of people do not think that other animals have this form of consciousness. This was the form of consciousness that Descartes claimed mechanical explanation couldn't understand. And he also claimed that mechanical explanation couldn't explain like free will. Mm-hmm. Or the use of language was a specific case of free will. And so why? Well, because it doesn't, like if you look at a mechanical clock, like there's always a physical antecedent cause that you can pick up that explains the next thing that's going to happen. And Descartes observed that like, well, in the case of whether or not I decide to like lift my arm, that's just not true. Like I can sit here all I like and not move my arm. And then I can also decide to move it if I want. And there doesn't appear to be any causal reason for me doing that. Mm. And so that was Descartes' mind body problem. He was like, how do I connect these two pictures I have? This picture of the world is mechanical, which seems to explain a lot. And Descartes had this whole crazy picture of like motion and how the planets moved around and this like fluid, like physical stuff to explain everything as having like a push-pull mechanism. Mm. And then connecting this thing mind in addition to that. And that was his mind body problem. Mm. But then this is what Chomsky argues, but it's a very different picture to what we have in philosophy today. Chomsky argued that like, okay, this problem no longer exists because Newtonian gravitation and physics showed that the world does not work like this at all. Mm. We just like the world is not full of push-pull mechanisms. And that doesn't mean that we cannot explain some things with push-pull mechanisms, but the fundamental nature of reality doesn't seem to work this way. Yeah. And a lot of people kind of push back on Newton being explained that way, including like physicists. And are more happy to say that like later on with people like Einstein that's happened, but Chomsky's like firm that this happened with Newton. And I think that is a really interesting insight because for philosophy of mind, what it means is that there's no longer a distinction between the mind and the body. There's just like our efforts to understand the world. Like Newtonian physics basically left this picture of like, we have no idea what the fundamental nature of the world is like, but here are these laws I have. I know how to apply them so that I can predict how things move. But it doesn't say anything about where the mind fits into this picture. And so the conclusion that Chomsky thinks you should just draw is like, well, there's no separation. We just try to understand the world the best we can, and we go from there. And to me, that just means, okay, we're studying the mind/brain. And you can do that by doing philosophy. You can do it by doing neuroscience. You can do it by studying trauma. You can do it by studying biomedical sciences. And none of these are like better or worse than any other ones. And you just have to figure out what you can figure out. And off we go. Yeah. And so that's a very long-winded way of saying why I don't think there's a distinction between the mind and the body.
I've never thought about this before. I've never explored this before. But just when you were explaining and everything, it kind of like, now that I'm thinking about it, it makes me think it's just like, this is a terrible opinion, but I don't know. I'm thinking, I feel like there is a more relationship between the body and the brain than it has with the mind. Because the way that I see it after you listening to your explanation, I feel like you're right. Like the body and the brain, there is a mechanical aspect to it, right? Like, and the thing is that it also gives us the space to study it with the more knowledge we gain in neuroscience, or like in our physical movement about our bones and muscles and all these kind of things. You can actually break down and study our body, and you can also break down and study our brain. There is obviously a lot more to study. Yeah, there's so much more to explore about the capabilities of this mechanical brain and this body. But I feel like mind is something you can't really study. The reason is because I don't think, I think we could confidently say your body and my body and anybody else's body has the same functionalities, and the brain as well has almost the same wires and neural networks and all these kind of things. But I feel like the mind is very unique to each person. uh so I don't know, I was just like, I kind of, suddenly I got the feeling maybe there's a more connection between the body and the brain than it is to the mind. And I feel like you're absolutely right. I think philosophy is one way to really explore the mind, actually. But then also, if it's like super unique to every individual person, then I also see a limitation there as well, of how to really, because you're right, I think consciousness, these things, dreams, these things all fall in the category of mind, right?
Well, I mean, I think your point is really interesting to think about. Like, it's definitely true, right? That like our minds, as we think of them in the ordinary sense, like they're so unique to us. Like, no two people have the same experiences. And to me, a kind of interesting way of thinking of that is just to say, yeah, because our bodies in the physical sense of like our limbs and our organs and our brains are completely interconnected with our environment and our lived history. When you take all of that into account, it makes so much sense that we're all going to have different minds, because our minds are going to be contingent on like our personal history. It's going to be contingent on the culture that we grew up in. It's going to be contingent on the things that, our parents told us were true and told us were false, and all these like different just like so many things like interacting in one. So to me, it's actually like it's more liberatory to stop thinking in terms of the mind body distinction in the strict philosophical sense, for precisely that reason. Like, when you use the word body as distinct from brain, that's already like not within the philosophy distinction that we have, because the philosophy distinction says that the brain and the body, in the sense of the human body, are just physical things, whereas the mind is mental. And so that like complexity that you bring up about, but like, how do we explain the fact that like our minds are so unique? Like, I feel like that actually gets like missed in the philosophical category. Like, that was one of the things I found so interesting about studying the biomedical literature around this and about studying trauma. It was like, it just showed how like our psyches and our bodies and like our brain and everything is so interconnected, not only with each other, but with our environment and with our personal history and with like the beliefs that we end up acquiring based on how we interact with our parents as children, and all of those things. And so that like complexity kind of just gets like overlooked if we like zone in on there's physical things in the world and there's mental things in the world, and we need to figure out how to connect them.
Yeah.